Bandwidth for changelog is provided by Fastly. Learn more at fastly.com. We move fast and fix things here at changelog because of Rollbar. Check them out at rollbar.com. And we're hosted on Linode cloud servers. Head to linode.com/changelog.
This episode is brought to you by Gauge. Gauge is a free and open source test automation tool by ThoughtWorks with a goal of taking the pain out of test automation for acceptance tests. To help with this, Gauge supports specifications in Markdown, which are easy to read and easy to write. Reusable specifications to simplify your code, which makes refactoring easier, and less code means less time maintaining your code. And finally, integrations. Use Gauge with your favorite tools and IDEs in the ecosystem of your choice, like Selenium and Sahi Pro, CI and CD tools like GoCD, Jenkins, Travis, and IDE support for Visual Studio, VS Code, IntelliJ, and more. The team behind Gauge believes in using web technology to test web applications. Head to gauge.org/JSParty to learn more and give it a try. Once again, gauge.org/JSParty. Hello, everyone, and welcome back to JS Party, a weekly celebration of JavaScript and the web. I'm Tim Smith, and today we've got a very special episode for you. KBall, Nick, and Suz were on location at Node plus JS Interactive in Vancouver. They talked with Tierney Cyren and Dave Methvin about the proposed merge between the JS Foundation and the Node Foundation, the planning and work that goes into a merger like that, and what it'll mean for both the ecosystem and everyday JavaScript developers.
Welcome those of you who showed up to our JS Party Live edition here at Node.js Interactive. We are excited to be here with you. So for those who don't know, JS Party is a weekly podcast celebration of the web. We typically record live on Thursdays. Look, we're recording live on Thursday. Here we go. When we're not at a conference, you can actually tune in online, listen to us, interact with us via the Slack channel. Since we don't have the Slack channel here right now, I'm counting on all of you to shout out your questions as we run through. Let me introduce who we've got here today. So there are three of us here who are regular panelists. I'm KBall. I'll be emceeing today. We've also got Nick Nisi.
Hello.
And Suz Hinton. Hello. And then we have two special guests here representing the big news of the conference. First, representing Node, Tierney.
Hi. How you doing?
And representing JS Foundation, Dave Methvin.
Hi.
We thought that maybe today we'd do a little bit of digging in, making these two guys uncomfortable, and find out a little bit more about what it is that these foundations do, why this merger is going to matter, what it's going to do, and kind of just explore for your common developer. I mean, I don't know about y'all, but 6 months ago, I had no idea that the JS Foundation did anything.
Sometimes
No
I
offense.
have my doubts, yes.
That's pretty brutally honest.
I mean, well, just because coming in as a developer, I was like, what do they do? So maybe we can actually start there. What do you guys do? I know there's value. What is it?
Yeah, well, foundations in general, I'll talk about the JS Foundation in particular. We provide a lot of the services. When you think about open source projects, they generally are created because somebody has a great idea and wants to write some code. And most of the time, the people who do that don't have skills in other parts of what would normally be done if they were, for example, a business, right? Now, they don't know how to deal with trademarks and copyright issues, which open source still has those types of things that they have to worry about. They don't know about the social issues of building a community that will help them in their joyous mission of writing the ultimate open source project. And so those are the places where the JS Foundation can help them in providing advice, mentorship, and support, including things like legal, if the need arises, and also help them find the kind of resources that they would want for, for example, they might need some CI servers. They may need access to software that normally when they try to go get those things and they're just like a small project, guys might say, well, we don't really offer those things to you. But if you're part of a foundation, the foundation has access to a much larger pool of resources and companies that can help you out as a software developer. And those are the kind of things that we do for our projects in the JS Foundation, and I'm sure Tierney would say the same for...
Yeah. I mean, so the Node Foundation is a little bit different than the JS Foundation because it's technically set up as an umbrella foundation, but we've kind of steered away from that and are just focused mostly on Node. Express and LibUV are both actually projects in the Node umbrella foundation, but they are both kind of happy doing their own thing and just being content and building their own stuff. But a lot of what we do in the Node Foundation, or what the Node Foundation does for Node, is provide a level of stability where large groups, like companies, can come and engage with the project and make sure that, know that there's something that it can fall back on and kind of provide that assurance of stability over the long term, and that we're not just like this rogue group of people who are going to go and destroy all their production processes. Like, it's not going to happen. And so the foundation kind of provides that level of stability and understanding of like, okay, this is like a legitimate thing. It's not going away. And then, that's kind of the external view. The internal view is we get a lot of benefit from being able to kind of have this large resource of, we can get things like conflict management training, which I think the Node Foundation is the first foundation in the LF collaborative projects to do. We're able to have a travel fund. I think we have tens of thousands of dollars dedicated or at least this year, and the budget is adjusted every year as the usage increases or decreases. But we have tens of thousands of dollars to send collaborators and contributors to the project to various events like JS Interact or Node plus JS Interactive, or any other kind of event that they might be speaking at, or they'd want to go and kind of represent the project. The foundation provides a way for us to do that and kind of support the maintainers.
So if I'm hearing correctly, it's one, doing all the things that I as a developer don't want to care about, and two, then providing joint resources and kind of an interface for companies that have money and are used to dealing with other companies to interact with rather than individual developers.
I'd say that's pretty spot on, yeah.
Yeah, and there's a longer list of things as well, which I think both foundations have contributed in various ways. The JS Foundation participates in both the W3C and in TC39, the JavaScript group, standards group. And when you think about it, that makes a lot of sense because, between the projects and the two organizations, we're most of the ecosystem that's consuming all of these standards, and we should be having a say in those things as those standards are developed. In the past, those have been very heavy in the browser writer groups, so controlled by a very small number of companies. Not that they have done a bad job in their stewardship, but it's just that when you're on the other side consuming these standards that are being created, it's very important for you to have a voice before they are delivered to you and you're told, eat what you've got. Especially in the case of the web, where nothing can ever really be taken away, only stuff can be added on top.
Yeah, and I think Node's kind of experienced that a bit with like modules. That's a really good example of that exact thing happening. And I'm really happy to say that I think that specific thing actually got us and the member companies who have people who are contributors to send those contributors to TC39, to work on making sure Node's voice is heard at TC39, so we can make sure we're not breaking Node as well. Because Node at this point, I think, is part of the web.
One way that I've interacted with the foundation is through contributing to those projects. And one big thing, probably the most visible thing, is through the contributor license agreement that you have to sign to do that. Does the Node Foundation have something like that? And I assume that the joint foundation will have that going forward.
So I think that's all TBD in the joint foundation. Node Foundation doesn't. And I think we do that very I think it was a very early intentional decision to not do that. There are some weird things that come with that, signing a CLA. And there's two sides of that. I think the Node Foundation kind of fell on one side and the JSF fell on the other. And I'm actually really excited to see where a new foundation, a joint foundation, kind of lands on that, because I think a CLA can be useful. If you look at what's happening with Linux, that's a little worrisome. I don't want that to be happening with Node, but at the same time, it's not really easy to relicense stuff. So yeah, it's an interesting problem that I'm really excited to go solve.
Let's step back for a sec. So folks who are here at the conference are probably aware of the big news of JS Foundation and Node Foundation announcing an intent to merge, hammering out details and things like that. But for the listeners who are listening to this who haven't been to the foundation, can you give a little backstory about what's going on here?
Do you want to start or should I? Okay. So the foundation, the Node Foundation and the JS Foundation have expressed an intent to merge. So this effectively, it sounds a lot more official than it is. It's really just us kind of saying, hey, we have these two bodies that are pretty similar, and we should be doing more collaborative work rather than kind of working separately. And so, working together also means we have a larger pool of resources. We can kind of collaborate a bit better. And kind of also build a broader home for JavaScript projects and even beyond that. So that's kind of where my understanding is.
That's my understanding as well. We do, because we have so much in common, and because so many people who are using many of the projects in the JSF are also using Node. I would guess the overlap is just about 100%. It makes sense for those communities to collaborate. We're also on the same committees, working on the same committees and doing similar things. So there's just so much that we have in common. And even in the non-technical areas, if you think of things like encouraging and promoting the use of open source software in the JavaScript community, helping people become contributors, all of those kind of things, that is all independent of the specific project, and something that it makes sense to try to get that knowledge and spread it out without having to think about, this is only for Node or only for Project X. So I think it's a great thing that we're talking about merging. Obviously, there's a lot of details to be worked out, but to me, it seems like a logical step.
So one interesting thing about doing something like a merger or any really big change is it kind of gives you a chance to almost reimagine what things could be like. And I know, talking with folks who've been associated with some of the projects in these different foundations, there's kind of mixed feelings. There's things where they say the foundation was great on this, and there's things where they say, this was kind of a pain in the butt, or this wasn't as helpful as I'd hoped it would be. What are some of the things that each of you would like to do differently, given the opportunity for a reset?
I don't want to go first. You go first.
All right.
I want a pretty logo.
You don't like the JSF logo?
It's okay.
Okay.
I don't know. I guess it's really hard to say on the general situations. I think it's I like if you look at the two organizations, as you mentioned, there's a lot of the Node Foundation gets to focus on the one project, and there's benefits to that, because you can specialize and say it's focused on this one project, whereas the JSF has to kind of generalize, which is good in a way, but it's also like you can't focus because you have to be careful about being too focused on one or two projects. So I would say in the merged organization, I think we kind of need to think about how there are going to be some projects that are naturally more active, more in development, and think about a way to set up tiers of especially when it comes to things like funding, how we do that in a way that's still fair to the smaller and less known projects, which is where I think like that pool of money to create contributors comes from, that they can go across everything, but you might focus some more of the financial investment in a small number of projects.
Yeah, so from the Node Foundation side, I think that there are benefits and drawbacks to having a sole focus. I think that politics can get muddied into that sole focus a little bit too much sometimes, and so having technical things be technical is useful, and having a separation of politics outside of that, because technical and politics often don't need to collide. They can, but they don't need to, at least not to the extent that we've had. And so, beyond that, I think that there's just a lot of a lot of little things that we can really improve. And we have a lot of experience from Node and the Node Foundation, both from the foundation side and from the technical side, like very small things that we should have optimized and we didn't. Examples are one example that I'm super passionate about is having technical people and community people, because Node has the technical steering committee and the community committee, but having those people engage with the foundation at a much more engaged level, like having them participate a lot more in the foundation work, I think is going to be super valuable to actually making sure that everything is working as planned, and we want to really we're all working together rather than kind of having an us versus them mentality.
Suz, you had kind of an interesting take on the us versus them and the sort of, shall we say, sometimes raucous relationships between different parts of the JavaScript communities?
Yeah. I mean, I think on a surface level, it makes a lot of sense because there's a deduplication of efforts for certain things and things like that. But I was also remarking about how, instead of it being like two sides fighting with each other, we're still going to expect a lot of, passionate feelings, but it's going to feel more like a family that's just fighting with each other instead. And so, at the end of the day, you still come together and realize that you have the same intentions and that you care about the same things.
So it's more like a coalition government rather than a two-party system. we have to get along so that we can create enough people to dislike the people on the other side. So.
Let's not do that.
Okay, well, just saying. I can see that. I definitely, there's a history there with the Node Foundation of having some conflict. And it's difficult coming from a relatively conflict-free organization to kind of understand some of what's going on. And I hope most of that, in any case, is behind us anyway. But also we can come up with an organization that makes it so that some of those conflicts are more in our control, that we don't, I don't see them being as much of a problem.
Yeah, that's definitely what I was talking about. And I know that modules have been like a super special case, but I imagine that something like this is going to come up again. And given that it's now going to become more of a group discussion, it's like what works for both runtimes, what works for both environments. If anything was to come up in the language, or even just if Node.js had that community had a certain idea, you hope now that the default would be that it would be discussed for both of those different scenarios, and that it would hopefully prevent something like this happening again, because it has taken 10 months, I've heard, to sort of start even reconciling that conversation and being able to plan something from the beginning with the two sides, which I'm, scare quoting, will just hopefully prevent that thing from happening. That's what I would like to see, at least. And so you're fighting together for like the one thing instead of trying to smash two things together that never really were compatible.
Yeah, and I feel like that's largely where both the Node TSC and the Node Community Committee are coming from, is like, this is a really good way for us to kind of clear the air for us as a project, because we've outgrown ourselves. We've gotten way too big for ourselves. Mm-hmm. And this provides a way for us to kind of, we've learned a lot of lessons, and like we know some of the things that we've done wrong and like what we can do better. And so I think that this is a really good opportunity for like Node as a project to actually make sure that we're not cutting people out, not putting additional burden on ourselves that isn't needed, while also making sure that we're going to be able to continue to grow, that we're going to be able to continue to enable other projects. Like Node would be nothing without its ecosystem, without its community. And so I think that this is a really good way for us to help ensure that not just the current generation of JavaScript, not just the current framework ecosystem, not just the current module system, but everything that JavaScript can and will be able to continue to be growing and continue having Node as a part of it.
This episode is sponsored by our friends at Rollbar. How important is it for you to catch errors before your users do? What if you could resolve those errors in minutes and then deploy with confidence? That's exactly what Rollbar enables for software teams. One of the most frustrating things we all deal with is errors. Most teams either A, rely on their users to report errors, or B, use log files and lists of errors to debug problems. That's such a waste of time. Instantly know what's broken and why with Rollbar. Reduce time wasted debugging and automatically capture errors alongside rich diagnostic data to help you defeat impactful errors. You can integrate Rollbar into your existing workflow. It integrates with your source code repository and deployment system to give you deep insights into exactly what changes caused each error. Give Rollbar a try today at no cost to you. No credit card is required. Our listeners get access to the Bootstrap plan with 100,000 events for free for 90 days. To get started, head to rollbar.com/changelog.
Do you think there's a little bit of FUD around this to a point where, when we talk about the browser, we don't want to break anything, right? It's like what we talked about before. We just add things. And I think that this might be a stereotype, but traditionally, I think that the Node.js community has sort of not had to have adhered to that as much, and they're able to rev full stable versions of things and do LTS and that kind of thing. Do you think people are worried that the progress and the fast progress that Node's always been able to make, which again could be acknowledged as some lessons as well, do you think that people are afraid that they're going to be slowed down because of this merger? Or
So I think that's an interesting question. Privately, some people have expressed concerns to me about we have a lot of people who have concerns, and this is dramatically increasing that scope. I don't personally agree with that opinion. I think having that kind of broader scope of cool, there's currently 15 projects. In a year, there will be 50 projects, or however many we kind of have. I think that will actually help Node kind of avoid that problem. But we're kind of already there. We have Graceful FS that won't ever go away. We're not going to be able to get rid of it. And for context, Graceful FS is a reimplementation of Node's FS, smoothing out some of the rough edges. It's not really great for Node, and we can't break it. We can't go break that. And so we've kind of already gotten to that don't break the web, except it's don't break the ecosystem.
That's a really good point.
Yeah, I think it's always the problem that the more popular you get, the more people are even though they can stay on a particular version for a while, they really don't want to invest the time and effort it takes to move ahead. So it's no, I want to stay with Node 6 or whatever and just keep giving me bug fixes. And really the web's been like that for 20 years, right? It's instead of actually breaking it and make people say, you should be moving up, we just keep accommodating it. I think there's less of an issue of breaking things when you're on the server side just because you have more control over the environment. You're not like in a browser where you can't control the browser. I mean, a good example of this is in a project I'm working on, we're considering accessibility issues, and we'd like to drop IE11 support. But IE11, 25% of the people who access our site with a screen reader are using IE11. So that's almost hostile to accessibility. It is hostile to accessibility to leave out IE11. So I think another thing that's good about getting all the JavaScript projects together is to try to make people understand consequences of things like making decisions to drop support for certain things, because sometimes it's not obvious to the person in a small project that leaving this out or not testing this can have a great impact on a small community.
Agreed. I mean, I've even faced that in personal examples where people ask me why I supported Node 0.10 for so long. And it's because in an IoT scenario, most people were running Debian, and that was the version that came down. And so they didn't even know how to install a more modern version of Node. And so it's only recently when it got to the point where my stuff was literally broken in Node 10 that I realized then that, we had to move forward. But people aren't aware of these edge cases, or they treat them as if they're edge cases that don't matter, but they can have such a huge impact on a small amount of people. And I think that we should be thinking about impact rather than just like a straight up number of people.
Right. Especially because they say, well, they can just upgrade. But the they is sometimes the most vulnerable and least able to move, right? It's the people with nobody helping them maintain that system, and they've got it running in a closet somewhere, and the guy set it up for them, 6 years ago.
Right.
And I think you touched on a really important thing there of like, when do I upgrade? When do I drop support for something? I was working with Sean Larkin, trying to help him figure out how to drop support for Node 4 and like when it was okay to do that before it went LTS. There's like no guidance for that. And so I think that's like one really positive outcome that could come from this is like, cool, there's like these, however many other projects. How many projects are I keep referring to this. How many projects are in the JSF?
I cannot even give you an exact count. It's over 20.
Okay. Yeah, so like these 20 plus other projects that want to like consider LTS and like have a similar kind of LTS structure, maybe like if they want to implement their own LTS, having a strategy on how to deprecate like node versions and what they support, that's really useful. Instead of reaching out to me and like asking, is it okay to drop it now or should I wait till like that's not a sustainable long-term thing. And so like that kind of guidance is something that I think is like something that's not necessarily obvious as a result of this, but I think it's something that will come. And I think there will be other things like that too.
Our local equivalent of a Slack channel was telling me the number is 28.
See, I knew.
Thanks, Zibby.
She looked at me funny.
So that actually raises kind of an interesting point when we talk about, possibilities for reimagining this, right? So there's, going back to what we said the foundations do today, they present a legal face, they help with marketing, they help with things, but there's sort of technical cross-culture and cross-fertilization and information that can happen here. How much of that happens today, and what are the foundations likely to do as a result of a merger to make more of that happen?
So my answer to that is, my answer to how much of that happens today is 0.
It's within plus or minus 0.5 of 0.
Yeah. So it can be negative 0.5.
I'm not exactly sure what negative cooperation, but I guess we work at odds with each other, right?
But we don't do much. Like we don't collaborate. And that's honestly like one of the biggest problems that I think Node has had is not having that kind of feedback of like, is this useful? There's an example of this right now with workers. Workers are a feature that we've implemented in Node 10 that's useful. Like it solves a problem that people have complained about for years and years and years. That said, we're trying to get people to use it. And it's hard. Like we need feedback on, is this useful? Is this API solid? Are there bugs before we can actually ship it? And we're not able, we as individuals are trying to go reach out to people to do it. Like every time, at every opportunity, I go tell people you should use workers.
The key to that is you should follow the rule of the browser makers and just prefix everything with -WebKit, and then everybody will use it.
But I know that Grid had this same problem too. Like so many people were using a bunch of CSS frameworks that smooth that over for them that they were having a lot of trouble getting people to just test out CSS Grid, where this is the time where you can have the most impact on this, and you never used to be able to do that 10 to 15 years ago when these specs were coming out. And I definitely see the parallels in the workers because people have just gotten so used to not having them now that it's very, very hard to say, no, this is your chance to actually make them good.
And they want to wait until it's available on every version of Node they have to support, so they don't have to write 2 code paths, which, you know what that does.
So an interesting question here is, what could the foundations do to really affect this? Because I know that, from the project standpoint, a lot of times you want the legal stuff to be dealt with, and otherwise you kind of want to be left alone. And yet, if you're left alone and everyone's left alone, we're all in these little silos and we're not getting it. So what's a potential path forward there, or what are some ideas that y'all have, or in the audience, if y'all have ideas, for ways to move forward and get more of that sort of cross-collaboration working across these big projects?
I mean, so I think one of the big things is being in a shared space. I think that's a really important thing. At least for Node, it's important because we have a hard time like reaching out. And so having people from a different background coming into Node. I was talking about this with Suz earlier, of like having the context of IoT is really useful for us because that's an edge case that like we all talk about apps. We don't talk about IoT, and like we need more of that.
And I've always traditionally felt like the fun police, like I'm like that weird edge case where we have this ragtag community, but IoT is actually a very serious thing that's happening now in the Node space. And I've seen so many talks at this conference this week, and I was like, oh, there's other people out there and they're actually like making money with this as a solution as well. And so it's great that you brought that up earlier because, there's a lot of communities like this that just don't feel as though they're basically like as influential as they should be in order to have a spot at the table.
Yeah, and I feel like that's something I work to kind of abolish. That's a fear that really frustrates me because like Node is for the people using it, and if you're using it, no matter how you're using it, your input is super, super valuable in making sure we don't break it for you. Like that's incredibly important. And that kind of comes back to don't break the web. But, we need to be sure we're hearing from these disparate groups who have very different interests to make sure we're building cool stuff. And like all the features we're doing seem to be mostly focused around like web forward and web apps. And like if there's a feature that would be useful for IoT that like nobody else in the world would use except for IoT users, cool, let's ship it.
I'm very excited that at the very least now we have Node Serial Port on the package list for where all the tests are run now.
Oh.
So we know immediately. Because remember Node 4 was particularly painful for us. And I think that's when it was painful enough for us to say something. And now we've actually felt super included as a result of that. We're very, very happy to have that package in there. So I think that you make an excellent point. Like I've never thought about Node as having missing features for IoT. But that's definitely something that I'm now going to think about, given that somebody has already suggested that to me now. So that's great.
So one of the other things that is important there is like Node Serial Port. That's a cool project. Where does that live right now? Is it just kind of an open source thing that disparate people work, like people who are totally different backgrounds work on because it's a passion project? Yeah,
it's moved around to different organizations on GitHub. It's now under the official NodeBots umbrella, so it's very much a community thing. And we've had a rotation of contributors, but there are some people who are working on it right now, like Francis, who has just done an amazing amount of work on it. But yeah, it very much relies on people having very specific knowledge. This is, one of the biggest native module add-on, libraries, and it takes a lot of time to ramp people up on it. So it is a project that could be at risk. There is a bust factor, and it's pretty small for us. And so yeah, that's something that we would be looking for support with.
And so that kind of plays into one of the things I'm most excited about a joint foundation is like that sounds like exactly the kind of project that I would want to possibly see. Make sure that I want to make sure this joint effort is a good home for. Because one of the things that I think a lot of people in the Node side of this are concerned about is like everything that already exists. And we're not considering the future of like, cool, we have this stuff now. This isn't the end. Like we're going to try to make sure this is an attractive and useful thing for projects everywhere. And so things like Node Serial Port, that kind of project makes sense in this case. And so like getting that feedback from maintainers and from contributors to other projects that haven't considered the JSF or the Node Foundation or haven't considered or like have added more useful feedback would actually probably be from people who explicitly decided not to join one of the foundations, because I want to make sure that this is something that's long-term and sustainable and something that people want to be a part of. Because if you don't have community like that, you don't have anything.
This episode is brought to you by DigitalOcean, the simplest cloud platform for developers and teams. Deploy, manage, scale faster and more efficiently on DigitalOcean. Managing infrastructure is easy for teams whether you're running one virtual machine or thousands. Use our special link to get $100 credit for DigitalOcean and try it today for free. Head to do.co/changelog. Once again, do.co/changelog.
So I have some pretty awesome news to share. We are now partnered with Algolia. If you've ever searched Hacker News, Teespring, Medium, Twitch, or even Product Hunt, then you've experienced the results of Algolia's search API. And as we expand our content, we knew that one day we'd have to either roll our own search solution on top of Postgres, or we could partner up with Algolia. And I'm happy to report that phase 1 of our search is now powered by Algolia. We're able to fine-tune our indexing, gain insights from search patterns and analytics. We can create custom query rules to influence ranking behavior, as well as improve our search experience by adding synonyms and alternative corrections to queries. Sure, we could build search ourselves, but that would mean we would be busy doing that instead of shipping shows like you're listening to right now. Huge thanks to our friends at Algolia for working with us. Check the show notes for a link to get started for free, or learn more by heading to algolia.com.
So what goes into making a project a foundation project? Like what would Node Serial Port, for example, need to do to become a foundation project if it wanted to? What are the steps? And I realize that might change through the merger, but
It's a great question, though.
yeah.
So, do you want to go with this?
I'll take a shot at it. I mean, I can tell you that that is trying to come up with specific criteria is something that the TAC at the JSF started to talk about early on, and we decided to punt because everything tends to be like looking at a project and thinking about, what its position is in the ecosystem, where it is in its life cycle. So we had a person come to us who was proposing that he join one person. Really, nobody else had contributed. It was a jQuery plugin for uploading files. And so it was kind of like a pretty narrow focus, but it was also like something where they didn't want to really continue working on it. They were looking for a place to put it because they didn't want to leave it on the doorstep of somebody and say, please take care of my baby. And that's not the kind of projects but if it's a project that's being developed with a group of people who are interested, and in particular, I think if it's not a captive of one company, like there are projects that are quite, that are open source, but they're really just owned by one company that controls it. It's in that company's repo, right? So nobody else can land a pull request except for that company because it's in their organization.
You mean like Node used to be?
Yeah. Exactly. and I think that's a perfect example of why it needed to come out, because you can't really have a community project that's owned by one company and controlled by one company. It could be open source in the license, but it's not really open source in the way that we think of Node today or all of the JSF projects.
Yeah. And to dig into that question, all of that is TBD. Like we're still defining that, and so that's why feedback right now is super, super critical. But there's a lot of prior art. JSF has prior art itself. CNCF has a lot of prior art as well. They're a very, very similar model to kind of what we're thinking about at this point. And that also includes the tiering system they have of like, I think it's incubator, then something in the middle, then graduate. I believe that's the structure. That's about right. So with that structure, that kind of lends a bit more space to accepting projects at different levels. So Node Serial Port is pretty mature. It's not as big as Node. I don't think it ever will be. So that would be a good fit for that like middle tier.
It's also the most wholesome community you're ever going to have under that umbrella if that were to happen.
I would love
That's a plus too, right? I mean, if you have like one dictator for life in a project who doesn't really even want contributions, that's not a good project, in my opinion, for something like this. But you're right. I mean, the rules are still open at this point.
Yeah.
But I think it's better to accept a project unless you think that the reason for somebody giving you a project is simply to get rid of it, right?
Yeah, and so that actually brings up another good thing another thing I'm super interested in helping define. when does a project fall out of the foundation? If a project is dead, if it has nobody contributing to it, if it has no trajectory, if it has nobody using it anymore, like nothing that effectively, if it's not affecting people, how do we define end of life? That's a hard one.
It is a hard one. There's a couple of questions that I think that we need to ask there. One is, what does it mean for a project to be dead? So, for example, one of the projects in the JSF is AMD, the good old original module loader. It's James Burke, I think, may touch the code every once in a while if it really needs something, but it's basically not, it doesn't need anything done to it. I think that the question that a lot of times people want answered is more of a signaling thing. Is this a project I should invest my time or use in my project? And so, the answer to that may be different than, is this project like dead?
Yeah.
Because there's a lot of projects that don't have a lot of activity but are heavily used. And AMD actually is one of them. So it's really more a question of, would I write, if I was building a new project, would I use AMD? Not unless it was already in the code base.
I think it also comes down to just does the project still need the foundation as well? It's not just, is it worth protecting, but does is the project able to do everything else, without having to be under that umbrella? And so that's something that a lot of projects will struggle with as well. They could be highly valuable projects, but they won't necessarily benefit from moving to become an official foundation project as well.
Yeah, if they have all their needs met, then there's not a lot of benefit from joining the foundation. I think the time at which I think a lot of projects find it most useful to join a foundation is when they're in a stage of growth. They're becoming popular, they're getting contributors, they want contributors, but they can't manage that process, and they don't really know what they need to do. And that's where mentorship can really help them kind of understand how to manage contributions. And they can also use the advantage of having some marketing of their project and working with people who have done this thing before so that they can learn how to do it.
So let's look a little bit at, if somebody's out there in the audience or listening to us at home and they're curious about getting involved, what are the different angles at which someone can come in? There's things like, I'm going to come in and look for a project to contribute to. There might be, I'm going to help, or I'm going to look at a conference. I'm going to go to Node.js Interactive. There might be things that somebody who works at a large company could do to help sponsor and that type of thing. Can you talk a little bit about what are the on-ramps to involvement?
Yeah, so I think there's multiple kind of levels, and it depends on how they want to get involved. If they want to get involved as a contributor to a project, that project will almost certainly have, at least in the Node project, I don't know about JSF, but every repo and every working group and every initiative in Node has a contributing file and also uses a consistent way to mark stuff as a good first issue, which is the good first issue label, which GitHub is standardized on now. So we really try to do that at the project level. If you want to get involved at more of the administrative level, I'll be totally honest, it's a lot of chaperoning and maintenance. It's a lot of administrative work, and it's not glamorous. That's one of the things in Node that's really hard is the glamorous work doesn't get done by a lot of people. It gets done by people who are paid to contribute, and that's fine, but it's hard sometimes. So, if you are interested in that, that's part of the area I'm interested in just personally. Go to, at least in Node, the TSC and the ComCom, there's ways you can begin to get involved there. Again, though, that's very administrative work and not necessarily going and getting involved in helping out with events or contributing to core. These things are very distinctly different. At the foundation level, if you want to have your company kind of come get onboarded, there's people you can talk to. I know Sir Novotny and Todd Moore. Sir Novotny is at Google, Todd Moore is at IBM. They are both, to me at least, they've both been very helpful in getting kind of an understanding of this and also kind of helping have discussions with my company about that stuff. And so, it's a good way to kind of helping guide me have discussions. So it's a good way to kind of get involved with if you reach out to board members. And generally, the board members have been very open. And so, that's a really good thing to kind of, a good way to go get involved if you want to join the foundation or a foundation.
That was a great bunch of points. And every time you said something, I was thinking of something as well that I wanted to add to that. So let me see how many of these I can remember and get in. The JSF, when we bring people on, projects on board, we have some kind of basic standards that we set up for them, a contributing file, a code of conduct, those kinds of things. And then part of the mentorship process is to get them a little further into that, having a core group of contributors who meets and works on the direction of the project, so it's not a BDFL style of project. On the contribution side, as far as on-ramps, I think one of the things that certainly I have done in the past as a developer is to think of contributions only in terms of code. And there are so many ways that people can contribute to a project that are often overlooked. Answering questions on forums like Stack Overflow, creating test cases. I mean, a lot of times you'll start to get reports from 4 or 5 people saying there's a problem, and they're very unspecific about what the problem is. And somebody who actually sits down and writes a test case is worth, $1 billion to me. Someone who will update the documentation in non-trivial ways. I mean, it's nice to have people fix typos, but a lot of times there's some heavy lifting to be done. Somebody needs to actually document a new API. All of those things are important, and those where we can use some contributions. On the last point about corporate, at the corporate level, I think that is a place where foundations really need to focus attention to get more companies involved. There are a lot of people, individual contributors, who are very passionate about contributing to open source. We can help them out the most by making sure that their companies feel the same way and that they will get some time out of their busy days so they're not having to go and, in the evenings and contribute their work in their off hours. So if we can do that and potentially get those companies as members, but at the very least get them so that they're contributing some employees' time, then that's going to be a major win and a great on-ramp for both people and organizations.
I think one of the most important things in there is recognition. To kind of drive both of those things, you have to recognize people. And that's one of the things Node is done okay with. It's not done great. And we have some plans that we're working on to kind of help to fix that a bit in terms of the new website stuff we're working on. But recognizing contributors and recognizing companies is an important thing to continue to drive that investment of personal time and of professional time. And so in that. I think that's something that we can kind of come away with as a common framework or as a common goal is what's a baseline level of recognition for our contributors that we need to have to make sure we're doing them a service and we're not just benefiting from them without giving something back as well.
Yeah, I think that the GitHub green square just doesn't really even begin to cover it, right? And it only covers certain scenarios.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, even like the GitHub org, I've known people who have gone to Node to get the GitHub org on their thing. That's like, I'm not faulting them, but that's not dry. We're not optimizing correctly to actually get a long-term sustainable project.
Yeah, it's a lot of effort to maintain lots of people that come in and out very quickly, but being able to foster deeper relationships with people ends up with higher quality work and less overhead as well, for sure.
So we're running a little short on time. Any last questions or takeaways from anyone on the panel or out in the audience? Questions you want answered about Node Foundation, JS Foundation, the upcoming merger? Nick or Suz, any other questions for our two guests?
I'm just excited that y'all mentioned Serial Poet.
Let's work together more on that. Let's try to make this a useful thing for Serial Port. Like that's a really good example, and I'd love to try to help with that.
Yeah, this might actually be a first one to tease it out. That'd be great.
Awesome.
And I'm just excited to see it going forward and to see what comes out of this.
Thanks for listening to this episode of JS Party. Assuming you're loving this show, rate, review, or recommend it wherever you listen from. It helps us reach new, awesome people. If this is your first time listening to JS Party, you can find more episodes and our other compelling shows at changelog.com/podcasts. The edit and mix was done by me, Tim Smith, and the music, as always, is brought to you by the one and only Breakmaster Cylinder. Thanks to our sponsors, Gauge, Rollbar, DigitalOcean, and Algolia. Bandwidth is provided by Fastly. Learn more about them at fastly.com. We move fast and fix things here at Changelog because of Rollbar. Check them out at rollbar.com, and we're hosted on Linode servers. Head to linode.com/changelog. Thanks for tuning in. See you next week.